PyConline 2020. It is really nice to be here with you and hopefully be heard by you, even if being here is really my house where I've been hanging out for the last 6 months anyway. But it is really nice to be here with you, more to the point. I'm Lilly Ryan. I am a penetration tester from Melbourne, a board member of Digital Rights Watch Australia, a former historian, and a current cyborg. This is also the first talk that I'm delivering to a camera instead of a live audience in the same room, so I apologize if my delivery is a little awkward and rough around the edges. Everything is a learning experience. And before you panic that our AV setup is having any problems besides the sound, no, I do not have any slides. I don't know about you, but I've spent most of 2020 looking at a screen. So for this talk, I would like to give you the chance to give your eyes a break. Just look out the window, watch the birds and the clouds, whatever you have available to you, and listen to this talk instead. Or swap to one of the other talks, I'm not going to judge. Today's topic is what we do in the shadows, where we're going to dig into the motivations behind the creation of underground corporate infrastructure, what's commonly known as shadow IT, and how we can create workplaces where we shouldn't have to feel like we need to work around the official channels just to get things done. Initially, I was intending to make a bunch of vampire jokes because the title kind of lends itself to that theme. But to be honest, the more that I wrote about the topic, the more I realized that the vampire theme wasn't going to fit no matter how I made it or tried to make it. And given that we're in the 20s again, I decided that it made more sense to talk about this topic through the lens of Prohibition in the United States in the 1920s, because I feel like 100 years is a nice time for a check-in point, and I cannot resist a historical analogy, which many of you will know. Anyway, more about that later. Firstly, what is shadow IT? It gets called many things: shadow IT, shadow infrastructure, feral IT, or my personal favorite, hedge infra. All right, hedge infra is not actually a thing that people say. Whatever name you use for this concept, it's referring to the unofficial system of software, infrastructure, and services that people in organizations set up of their own accord that exist outside the purview of the usual IT team. And this could be things like the WhatsApp group that you chat to your colleagues in and use to coordinate coffee breaks, the Dropbox account or the Google Drive folder where you and your teammates share files that you want to access outside of work, the personal AWS account of one of the devs, which was used to experiment with new Infra because requesting company resources was taking too long, or the Slack instance that someone set up for your workplace that nobody's actually paying for because it's too expensive. As an aside, I'm pretty convinced that the majority of Slack's business model is getting people to sign their organizations up with the free thing and then being so useful and awesome and indispensable to the internal collaborative process that the company is eventually forced to pay the incredibly expensive per seat costs or risk another company holding everything but the last 10,000 messages hostage. But I digress. Shadow IT is all this stuff that's kind of cobbled together around the edges for convenience or out of desperation that nobody's supposed to talk about, but somehow everybody from the grads to the execs has used in some form or another, maybe without even realizing. Speaking as someone whose job it is to investigate systems and report on the existence of things like this, shadow infra is also a security team's worst nightmare. If the company can't control the systems that are being used to transmit sensitive information, whether that's actual confidential data or just leaking interesting information about business processes, then they have no way of realistically containing data breaches or patching the things that are being used or making sure that people are removed from the system when they leave the company. And yet security teams are also made of humans. You'll probably find us on the unofficial Slack as well. We get frustrated by opaque processes and rules, just like everybody else. Sometimes we end up being the Prohibition-era cops drinking cocktails at the speakeasies after hours, just like everyone else. Which brings me to Prohibition. So for historical context, in January 1920, the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution came into effect, banning the sale and manufacture of alcohol in the United States. This amendment had come about as the result of decades of campaigning on a complex tangle of issues. Moral arguments around alcohol as a vice, the need to deal with the toxic culture that centered around saloons, and the rate of crime, domestic violence, and abuse that was linked to excessive drinking. Prohibition was hailed by many as the noble experiment. It was a way to solve all of America's problems at once. But by 1933, it had been repealed by the passage of the 21st Amendment. And when we think of the 1920s now, we might think of Al Capone or moonshine, flappers and jazz, of speakeasies and decadent parties and fancy cocktails. And we associate this era of what was supposed to be the golden age of temperance with these kinds of things because the business of alcohol drinking never stopped. Many people made bank on selling bootleg liquor all up and down the country, and those affected by alcoholism only became more desperate as they were denied real help and forced into illegal situations that often put them at greater risk than before. Like any analogy, this analogy is not perfect by a long shot. My time slot today isn't infinite, so I'm going to be glossing a whole lot of extremely complex topics and historical events, which means there are points that I'd really love to get into discussion with you about in the questions in the hallway track afterwards, but I like analogies anyway. And the story of what happened with Prohibition in the 1920s in the United States has a great deal in common with that document that you just forwarded to yourself out of your work email so that you could access it on another computer. Strict rules implemented without consideration for reality often force very human behaviors into the shadows and create a totally different, sometimes set of more difficult problems than the initial one that they tried to solve. So when you have security procedures blocking your actual work left and right, it's pretty easy to get frustrated and wonder who they're actually protecting and why they're there. I'm willing to bet that there's a non-zero number of you listening to me right now who have been frustrated by a company laptop that has the USB ports disabled because viruses or something, but that really means that you can't get a copy of the document to the person who needs it to do their job. Or having to fill out 2 separate forms to try and get permission to install a program on your own machine, something that you need to do your job today, but that probably won't be seen by anybody until next week because bureaucracies are like that, by which time the concept that you needed to prove or the deadline that you needed to meet has passed. IT works quickly. Bureaucracies often don't. It turns out to be easier to go rogue and share a snippet on GitHub than to wait for your account to be given commit access to the repo that you need. Plus, anyone with a background in user experience is probably itching to tell you that the data that we get from examining what people actually do in the shadows can lead to really important insights about the way that people want to work together. UX specialists have been talking about this since forever. By observing how people actually work with your systems, you can get an idea of what they expect to be able to do and then go and build that thing to support them. You might hear people talk about desire paths in this context. A desire path is that patch of bald ground worn by the feet of thousands of people taking the same shortcuts every day between paved walkways. Some public planners have started to pave these over to create better resources for people to get where they're already going. Other planners even let their population do the planning for them. At one university in the United States, they didn't build any paths across one part of the campus at all for an entire semester. They waited for the desire paths to form naturally as students went about their day, and then they paved them all to make them official. So this is a pretty 101 UX concept, but security is also kind of infamous for its lack of user experience consideration. When our job is to see adversaries everywhere, we often think about what we need to prevent well before we realize what we need to allow, if we take the time to think about it at all. And if we live in this mode long enough, we might sometimes forget to take that security hat off and think about it like a normal human. So we block and we ban and we prohibit. The thing about prohibition is, though, that it never really works. It's a time-tested economic principle. If you ban something that was providing a mutually beneficial exchange in some way, the ban will most likely fail to achieve its goal. The lesson that came out of the 1920s in the US was that if you crack down really hard on a particular thing, then you end up creating an underground where that particular thing becomes less regulated and even more dangerous, even if it looks like by some metrics you might be succeeding in your original goals. By criminalizing the sale of alcohol, prohibition advocates were actually successful in reducing the per capita rate of alcohol consumption, simply because alcohol was harder to come by. Rates of absenteeism at work also plummeted as it became more difficult to openly justify time off due to drunkenness or having a hangover that you weren't supposed to have. Several alcohol-related health issues like liver disease also declined. But as it became illegal to produce things like beer with a lower alcohol content, it meant that when people did drink, they ended up drinking things like moonshine and strong spirits that were easier to distill quickly and in secret. They got drunker, faster, and sometimes without intending to or realizing the impact that that drink was going to have. People also ended up drinking industrial alcohol, which was still legal to produce. And when they did, they often ended up severely ill, blind, or dead because of the poisons that were introduced into the alcohol by the government to try and make it undrinkable. And jail cells and criminal courts around the country filled up at ridiculously high rates and developed incredible backlogs due to the increased number of alcohol-related arrests which also predominantly targeted people of color and other minority communities. It's hard to tell just how much Prohibition actually increased corruption and criminal behavior because a lot of speakeasies and bootleg operations didn't keep good records because they weren't supposed to exist. But the fact that we still associate the time period with guns and gangs should tell you something about the way this behavior permeated the public consciousness. It's also really hard to get data on how much shadow IT exists or how far it reaches because when these systems are banned outright, they're forced to exist outside of official boundaries, and the lack of data makes it harder to work out what people want to be able to do in the workplace or to get the benefits out of these systems because we have no easy way to measure digital desire paths the way that a town planner might see the tracks across a public park, so we don't know what we need to support. And by banning these things, we end up creating backlogs for ourselves. If we block USB ports on laptops, we push people towards setting up Dropbox accounts to share the documents the way they want to, and vice versa. And if we block both, people might just start using a different laptop entirely. Or really, at the end of the day, they quit the organization and we lose a good worker. I don't know about the rest of you who work in the security industry, but I don't think that most people get into InfoSec to become life ruiners who ruin lives. Sure, we don't all work in corporate IT security teams because this is a very large discipline, but a lot of us do end up there. And while you do occasionally get unlucky in an org and end up dealing with a security team that contains paranoid people on a power trip, more often than not, the team is implementing their rules for a reason. To understand it, it might just be that we need to think our way into their perspective. It is literally the security team's job to protect their organization from hackers, information leaks, and attacks. And like most fundamental roles, it's most noticeable when it fails and your organization ends up on the front page of the internet. While you might be frustrated with things like multi-factor authentication in order to access your email or having to request access to install a program, you probably aren't seeing the mail rules that stop your inboxes filling up with get-rich-quick spam or having your services constantly taken down by drive-by script kiddie attacks. You're most likely concerned, and rightly so, with making sure that you and your team can do what you do easily, but a good security team will be thinking about organizational risk management as a whole and trying to balance those larger scale needs against the more specific use case that you might personally have. And while amendments and exceptions can and should be made, because policy should be a living document, not holy scripture, it's not always practical or possible to think of all of them ahead of time. So you end up with having to request special permission for things you need to do your specific job, which can sometimes take longer than you want. From this side of history, it can be hard to make sense of why the Prohibition laws of the 1920s were actually considered at all, let alone how they passed. It's easy for us to only see the particular brand of corruption and hypocrisy that grew out of this situation. The politicians who wrote Prohibition into law, stockpiling expensive liquor for their own personal use before their own laws came into effect, for example. But you don't get an amendment to the US Constitution just because. There were plenty of people from all parts of the political spectrum who advocated for Prohibition for a plethora of reasons and had been doing so for over a century to that point. One of the things people often forget is that many of the folks who supported Prohibition were first-wave feminists who fought equally as hard for women's right to vote as they did for closing down distilleries. This wasn't just a matter of women's delicate sensibilities or rigid ideas about morals, although those things definitely played into the campaign, but because the problem of alcoholism and domestic violence that drunkenness could exacerbate was an exceedingly gendered one. And women and children who often weren't permitted into the spaces where alcohol was served and consumed were sometimes only ever seeing the men in their lives coming home drunk, sometimes unable to work, and in the worst cases, violent. Because divorces weren't easy to get in those days, and because it wasn't easy for women to earn enough of an income by themselves to support a family, banning the sale of alcohol was seen as a way of resolving the situation. If people couldn't get drunk, then it followed all the other issues linked to alcohol would also go away. And it seems like a simplistic way of looking at things to us now, knowing what we know about how events transpired, but it's important to understand how tempting it is to feel like things might be able to be solved in such a straightforward way as just banning the behavior without actually addressing it. It wasn't as though the women of the time were prey to this kind of magical thinking either. For many of them, it was the only lever they had the power to pull. White women were only granted the right to vote the same year that Prohibition came into effect. And for women of color and many others, it took far, far longer. And all women were still subject to social structures and expectations that kept them in the home as mothers rather than being able to choose their own paths through life. Campaigning for Prohibition gave women a socially acceptable pathway into politics for basically the first time in the United States. And among many, there was the hope that after Prohibition, they would have laid the foundations to make many more nuanced changes that would benefit everyone. The rules that end up being enforced in our workplaces might also seem too simplistic and broad and naive. But sometimes these, too, are because they were the only lever that someone could pull. Workplace politics is, in some ways, even more cutthroat than actual politics. People go in with the best of intentions, but they have to start from somewhere. And hope that they can do the best they can with the tools that are available to them, even if that tool is a blunt instrument. So, yeah, at the end of the day, the 18th Amendment was repealed, and in 1933, people were legally allowed to manufacture and sell alcohol again. Prohibition had partially solved some of the issues that it had set out to solve, but it simply didn't work in terms of stopping people drinking, and in many cases, it created even bigger problems, and then made it illegal or difficult to talk about them and address them openly. It still stands in the history books as the only time an amendment to the US Constitution was ever repealed, which is generally considered a pretty big deal. In my view, one of the most important things that we can take out of Prohibition's repeal that applies equally well to tackling the problem of shadow IT is this: complex problems require multifaceted solutions and active, informed collaboration in order to be addressed. This means that broad solutions are always going to be kind of broken and will never really address what they're intended to address, no matter how people care. Prohibition wasn't just trying to solve the problem of alcohol. It was trying to solve the problems of women's rights, domestic violence, addiction, ethnicity, class, race, poverty, morality, religion, issues that we have by no means solved today. Similarly, shadow IT isn't really just one problem. It's about accessibility, security, convenience, collaboration needs, organizational politics, and it's often juggling a complex mesh of threat models, some of which conflict with each other. So external threats such as hackers, nation states, corporate spies, and competitors, internal threats such as disgruntled employees, honest mistakes, opportunism. We solve this not by enacting blanket bans or blocks, but by addressing individual problems as they come up. No matter whether you work in security or you work as a developer or you work in a totally different role, here are the main things that I'd like you to take away and think about from this whole bucket of ideas and analogies we've just meandered through. 1, banning things outright doesn't work. Prohibition is one example, but there are many others throughout history, recent and ancient. You just have to look. 2, most problems aren't a one and done kind of thing. They're ongoing maintenance issues and they need to be treated that way. Security policies need updating and regular care, just like getting a haircut or mowing the lawn. Times change, tech changes, and the way people want to work with each other changes. So good security policy should be living documents with space for all the messy and brilliant things that human beings are, rather than unchanging gospel. 3, it's important to try and understand the perspectives of others. This doesn't just apply to work, but it definitely does apply here. Sometimes you might reflect on a rule and suddenly realize what the rule is actually trying to solve. Sometimes, though, a security rule might be unnecessarily burdensome. And sometimes the security team might think so too. But perhaps it's the only lever that was available for them to pull at that time. See if you can work with them to address the actual issue. See what's blocking them from making more practical rules. It might be a policy that was imposed on the business a long time ago and has never been updated. Maybe it was a policy framework that was never even tailored for your business at all. Lots of frameworks suffer from boilerplate applications in places that they don't really fit. See if you can work together to understand everyone's needs and make the thing fit properly. And on that note, 4, the best approaches aren't authoritative, they're collaborative. If your security team is behaving like the computer police, blocking everything, they're not going to be doing the best job that they could be. And most of the time, they probably don't want to be behaving like that anyway. Ideally, we should be able to see each other as partners with a common goal rather than adversaries. It's going to be a different starting point for every organization, but have a think about what you can do to get to that place. This talk isn't intended to be an exhaustive exploration of the topic of shadow IT, and definitely not the full story about that or about Prohibition. But the topic is one that I feel very passionately about. So I'm hoping that you'll all have a lot of questions and thoughts for me afterwards, because I would really like to continue discussing it. Thank you so much for joining me today and for being part of PyConline AU 2020. I'm looking forward to seeing you all later. Bye.
Thank you so much for that enlightening talk. Despite the tech issues, you handled that like an absolute champion. We've run out of time, but everyone is available in the security and privacy track chat in Venue List to have a discussion with you. And thank you again for just being around, being awesome, and giving us a time to rest our eyes. Oh, I've lost sound now.
Oh, that was my fault. My mic was on mute. I hope you enjoyed it and you did get a chance.